Luis. Thanks for having us here today. Just want to let you know that I've sat in on today's proceedings and have really enjoyed all the panelists and that they had to share. And I hope everyone else is gaining a lot from today's conversation. Throughout the symposium, we have lifted up community voice on the topic of environmental justice. In this panel, we will be speaking with legal practitioners and community members about how they grapple with environmental racism in their work. Critical to this conversation is a recognition that institutional racism exists, is systemically pervasive, lacks critical community voice, and that we all have a role to play in undoing racism in our work. In this panel, we will hear from individuals covering a spectrum of experiences working in the field of environmental justice and specifically undoing environmental racism. While some of our panelists are early on the trajectory to embrace environmental justice, some have been incorporating environmental justice into their work for decades. We do recognize that everyone is at a different place in their own journey to be anti-racist, and we hope this panel will be an opportunity to learn how some community members have incorporated environmental justice into their professional lives. Finally, we hope to inspire you to continue to learn and take action in support of communities of color and environmental justice. With that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists who will each speak for 5 to 8 minutes about their experiences before we open it up for question and answer period. Our first speaker that we have today is Aurora Janke. Aurora is the Managing Assistant Attorney General with the Environmental Protection Division of the Washington Office of the Attorney General. Prior to joining the Washington AGO's office, Aurora worked for Earth Justice in the Northern Rockies office and for Perkins Coie in Seattle. Aurora clerked for the Honorable Ronald M. Gould on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and her practice includes a wide range of environmental topics. Following Aurora will be Olgi Diaz. Olgi works by day as the Government Affairs Director and lobbyist for the land use, conservation, and stewardship organization, Forterra. She serves as the Vice President of the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Coalition Board and is on the board of Casa Latina. Olgi wants to live in a world where immigrants, like her parents, are treated with dignity, and also that the city of Tacoma gets the respect, but none of the gentrification it deserves. To that end, she lives and breathes government, campaigns, and policy. Over a 15-year career in politics, she has worked as a staffer inside government, on the outside advocating for policies, and in the field electing public officials at every level of government from school board to president. In addition, Olgi spends most of her spare time building up future leaders and training candidates to run for office through her roles on the National Women's Political Caucus of Washington and Institute for a Democratic Future boards. She ran for office 8 years ago, back before it was hip for young women of color to do so, and is a special kind of political nerd who can tell you the legislative or congressional district at any moment on a road trip. Her work experience includes 5 years in the Washington State House and Senate, One America, Planned Parenthood, NARL Pro-Choice Washington, the Washington State Democrats, and even a 2-month stint as the congressional intern for Representative Adam Smith. Outside of work and boards, you can find Olgi soaking up any ounce of the Pacific Northwest and sunshine with her Chiwini Pepita and cat Pepino. So she, animal lover we have here. Following Olgi is Susan Balbas. Susan identifies as Cherokee Yaqui and is board chair of the nonprofit Front and Centered, a statewide coalition of over 60 community of color-led organizations working towards environmental justice. She's also the executive director of the Naahill'ahee Fund, a native-led community-based organization that advances sustainable indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest. She also currently serves on the boards of Washington Progress Alliance and the Potlatch Fund in Seattle. She holds a Bachelor of Business Administration and Masters of Science and Teaching and carries valuable experience in all levels of nonprofit operations and management. She was a National Training and Technical Assistance Specialist for multiple tribal youth programs for the U.S. Departments of Justice tribal youth programs. Susan has also been an independent consultant working with tribes, artists, and nonprofit organizations, and formerly the Chief Development Officer at United Indians of All Tribes Foundation in Seattle, Development and Donor Education Corner at Changemakers Foundation in San Francisco, and Executive Director at the Naya Youth and Family Center in Portland, and finally, Outreach Director at the Western Water Alliance in Seattle, where she was the primary researcher on water and related environmental issues. She is the mother of 3 and grandmother of 3, and has studied extensively with herbalists, is an avid gardener, cook, and voracious reader of historical novels. So with that, what I'd like to do is then turn it over to our panelists, starting with Aurora, followed by Olgi, and then finally with Susan, and then again, some questions and answers. So thank you. Aurora?
Thank you so much, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Steve. My name is Aurora Janke, and I'm a Managing Assistant Attorney General in the Environmental Protection Division of the Attorney General's Office. I'm very excited to share about our work and our plans to grow our environmental justice work in our division and in the Attorney General's Office generally. I just want to emphasize that I come to this conversation and this panel with a lot of humility. I know that I have a lot to learn. We know in our division that we have a lot to learn, and I'm thankful to be here as part of the symposium and as part of this conversation, and so thankful to have had the opportunity today and yesterday to learn from all of the excellent speakers at this symposium. I also want to extend a huge thank you to our Attorney General's Office policy team led by Sahar Fati. You haven't seen all of these folks in the last few days, but they've been working behind the scenes and are really a key part of why this symposium has happened, and they've done such an excellent job. I also want to extend a thank you to Gonzaga University. I am humbled to have something in common with President Sharp, as I am also a proud graduate of Gonzaga. I attended for undergrad, and I very much share President Sharp's thanks for the great foundation of a Gonzaga education. So before I launch into kind of the substance of my remarks, I do just want to note that while I'll talk about the office of the Attorney General and the work of the Environmental Protection Division, the views expressed today are those are my own views and not the views of the Attorney General's office as a whole. So what is the Environmental Protection Division of the Washington Attorney General's office? As Attorney General Ferguson mentioned yesterday, we are the litigation arm of our office's environmental protection and justice work. The division was created in 2016 by Attorney General Ferguson to bring lawsuits on behalf of the people of the state of Washington to protect the environment and public health. I'll talk a bit more about the types of cases we've already been working on, but I want to begin by talking about what we hope to do in the future because it includes all of you. Frankly, we as a division and an office recognize that we need to do more to use litigation as a tool to fight for environmental justice in Washington, and we are actively working to incorporate environmental justice values and considerations into all of our casework in our division. We are dedicated to working in partnership with communities to make a real impact for Washingtonians, and particularly those in low income, BIPOC, and communities that face disproportionate environmental and public health harms. As part of our efforts, we're in the process of hiring an attorney who will be entirely focused on environmental justice, but one person alone is not enough, and we believe that advancing environmental justice is a critical component of everyone's job in our division. We are also working with our policy team, the great minds behind this symposium, to align our office's litigation and policy efforts on environmental justice. And critically, as so many of the panelists that we've heard from in the last 2 days have made clear, we know that in order for this work to be effective, our environmental justice work must be driven by impacted communities and must center community voices. And so we are working on building community relationships and community trust as a critical foundation for our environmental litigation efforts around environmental justice. Now, I want to take the opportunity to talk a bit about the work that we have done over the past few years to give you a sense of the community impacts of our work and how we have partnered with tribes and other nonprofit organizations in our work. In particular, I want to focus on our lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's rollback of environmental protections under the National Environmental Policy Act. And while this case might seem really wonky and something like National Environmental Policy Act, or as it's commonly referred to as NEPA, might seem like a convoluted federal law, at its heart, NEPA and our lawsuit around the regulations implementing it is really a case about centering community voices and protecting the environment and public health for all communities. So what is NEPA? NEPA is basically our nation's bedrock environmental statute, and it really implements democratic values by requiring federal agencies to look before they leap and to analyze environmental and public health impacts of agency actions before they occur. So for example, if a federal agency wanted to build a new freeway, it would have to comply with NEPA. And for decades, NEPA has helped communities to protect themselves by forcing agencies to disclose information about harmful pollution and climate change impacts, and requiring agencies to consider less harmful alternatives to their proposed actions, and importantly, listening to the community about better ways to take action or potentially not to take action at all. And while NEPA isn't always a perfect tool, it is a tool that can lead to litigation where agencies fail to comply with their obligations. And communities and states like the state of Washington can sue to hold federal agencies accountable. As a result, NEPA can be a really important tool for communities to have a voice in the federal decision-making process and can be a really key tool, particularly for advancing environmental justice. In case you're curious, Washington does have a similar state law for state agencies called the State Environmental Policy Act. I won't get into that, but I do just want to flag that is another place for community voice and actions in our state. So turning back to our litigation, in July of last year, the Trump administration issued new regulations that do some pretty bad things, including restricting access of communities to the public participation process under NEPA, and also limiting federal agencies from considering important environmental impacts like climate change and environmental justice impacts. So as a result of those bad regulations, Washington co-led with California a lawsuit challenging the regulations. And our coalition on that case, just that one case, includes 21 states, Guam, Harris County, Texas, and New York City, to give you a sense of just how broad the impact of this law is and how concerned different jurisdictions are with this law. But the states were far from alone in challenging the NEPA rule, and 4 other cases challenging this rule were filed by nonprofit groups and community organizations, including many organizations that are dedicated in their work to advancing environmental justice. And all of that stemmed from the concerns about the impacts of this new rule on communities and public health in our shared environment. So really our multi-state suit here, well, we are, it's a multi-state suit. We really joined and supported the chorus of community voices seeking to protect our shared environment and advance public health. And this model of the state of Washington, either in conjunction with other states or acting on its own, filing a suit in partnership with other entities, be the tribes or community organizations, is something that we've done more than once. For example, about 2 years ago, we joined a lawsuit that was brought by the Suquamish tribe, Puget Soundkeeper, and the Washington Environmental Council against the Navy for its failure to comply with the Clean Water Act in cleaning decommissioned aircraft carriers in Puget Sound. And we're also part of litigation challenging the efforts to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil and gas development, because for Washington's interest, it threatens migratory birds and increases climate change impacts. But that suit is one of 4 suits, and 2 of the other suits are brought by nonprofit organizations with interests in preserving the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But the 4th suit was brought by tribal entities, and in recognition of the aligned sovereign interests that the state of Washington and the other states in our lawsuit have with the sovereign interests of those tribal entities, we filed our lawsuit on the same day as the Native Village of Venati Tribal Council, the Arctic Village Council, and the Venati Village Council. And that was a deliberate act to really focus on the sovereign interests that are impacted by the federal government's efforts to drill in the Arctic. So this is really generally what I wanted to share with you today about our division's work, both past and what we hope to do in the future. And I recognize that we are late to this work and there is much to do, but I'm also very thankful to be here and to listen and learn from others as we seek to build partnerships and bring cases to fight environmental racism in our state. And I believe in the chat, my contact information and our division chief, Bill Sherman's contact information will be there, so that if you have any questions or you want to reach out to us about issues in the state, you can do so through that contact information. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aurora. Just want to let you know that I don't feel as though you and your office are late to the party. We need to continue to build the coalition across all sectors of government and community. So just really glad that the Attorney General's office is here supporting this effort in such a large way. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Olgi.
Hello. I guess I will wait and see if there's a flag here on the play in case anyone can't hear me, but I assume my Zoom is working here in this virtual life we live now. I'm going to start off by telling y'all a little bit about myself and why I choose to do the work that I do before I get into sort of the work that we do at Forterra and the direction that we're trying to move in. Seeing no flags, I will go ahead and jump into that. So, as a child of the 90s, I really grew up hearing about the hole in our ozone layer and the importance of recycling, and really sort of indoctrinated with things like Fern Gully, right? But beyond that, I didn't really see the work of protecting our planet and our environment as my career path. I actually really wanted to work with people. I wanted to be a doctor. And I deeply value the need to preserve our habitats on the individual level, but it just didn't seem like the thing for me. So when I got to college and being a doctor didn't work out because science decided that that wasn't the path for me, my grades were not reflecting that, I decided to switch into politics. And I've really been working in government, outside of government, and pushing for new voices to be in government for the majority of my career. And it's been really rewarding to see the change in our representation and reflection in government in just the last 4 years. But overall, I think we still have a long way to go. In Washington in particular, it does not matter if I have worked at a nonprofit that is majority woman-led or majority of people of color-led. Washington's still just a very white state. That is just the reality of it. We also have our 29 federally recognized tribes, and so we live at a very interesting intersection where the dominant culture needs to listen to those communities more and better, and we do it better than many places, but there's still a lot left there that folks don't really know how to reconcile. But when they choose to listen, they really do gain quite a bit. So in particular for me, as being the only person of color in most rooms, no matter where it was that I happened to exist that day or that career or that meeting, I often choose to dig into these places because I know, as someone who is just the daughter of immigrants, I don't have parents who open doors for me in the way that some folks had. Their parent was someone important somewhere and got them things. I want to get into a room and I really want to hold the door open and say, all the other people of color, come in here. This is where we can come and make change, but we have to have this seat at the table. That is really my passion in government and politics, and now in the work of environmental justice here through my little piece of a land trust organization. I believe very strongly that the moral arc of the universe is long and that it bends towards justice, but it only bends that way when we're in here and we're doing the work and we're making it happen. It's not just going to happen on its own. The folks in power aren't just going to give away their land or their resources or their time without folks like us in the room banging down the doors, asking for it and demanding of it. So I think at this point in my career, I really chose to go into the environmental sector, despite sort of not having seen myself reflected in the work or in the space in the past, because of this important intersection moment we have with environmental justice, with social justice. It's just a moment in time that felt really good to capitalize on and move forward in, and really get in the room. And like I said, make room for more people to come behind me. I'm not the one who's going to break down the barriers that have been around for centuries before me, but I can certainly do my little piece while I'm here to make sure that it keeps getting pushed after me. And so for me, the work that I do at Forterra is very much talking to government officials about projects Forterra is doing. And Forterra is a Washington-based nonprofit land trust that is, I jokingly call it a non-traditional land trust, because we do building and because we do the traditional work of land trusts and conserving and stewarding land. But Forterra does this with a guiding vision to see people and nature thriving in coexistence. And we do that through these land-based solutions to help support healthy environment and resilient communities for all. And so we like to do economic development in rural communities, and we promote conservation in urban and rural communities. We're really in every corner of the state, and predominantly up and down that I-5 corridor, you'll see lands and Forterra projects all about. One of the exciting new spaces that Forterra has dove into in probably the last several years is actually building in urban cores. We are working with partner organizations like the Hilltop Action Coalition, and we have an investment council in Hilltop that we convene to work on a development to build cooperative housing in a neighborhood that's frankly gentrified. That's why I talk about trying to make sure that Tacoma isn't gentrified. I think it has been and continues to be a bedroom community for Seattle, but we are our own distinct people with our own distinct culture, and we have to do what we can to preserve it. And Forterra is trying to bring folks back into that neighborhood who have been displaced into other communities. And that for me is a really exciting project and time to be a part of, a land trust who's looking at our urban scapes and our rural scapes and seeing how we can use our land better, not just for our environment, but also for the people who live in it. We also have a project we work on in Tukwila in partnership with a mosque, where they're also building co-op housing for their immigrant communities. And so I think in that work, as a person of color in a predominantly white-led organization, it's my place to not solve all of the problems, because it's a white-led organization. There's gonna be problems with how we deal with race no matter what we do, because we just are all with our own unique histories and experiences that we bring to the work. But it's my job in this is to really help people try and be more open-minded with each other and try and not do too many predetermined assumptions on people's intent or people's thought out their objectives, pre-prescribed objectives, because we don't know where folks are coming from. They may be wanting to do something. Impact is very different than intent, but we have to try and be humble with each other, as especially the white-led organizations work with community, and be the listening ear as much as the person who's driving the work, and holding ourselves accountable to the promises that we make to community, and doing so in the way that we approach the tactics in working with community. So I think I'll leave it there just to be mindful of my time, but we can come back to any questions around my projects or work, and I'm sure I can give my contact info for folks interested in learning more about the work Forterra is doing across the state, and particularly how we can do more work with more folks better, because I'm new to Forterra, just a little over a year in, and I think I don't know all of the history yet. There's certainly history with lots of folks in a 30-year organization, no matter where you're at. So I'd love to be a resource for folks in community on any side. Thanks so much.
Olgi, thanks so much for your talk. Really glad to see that you're being successful at Forterra. And just know that there's, I think, a lot of community partners and people in government that would love to partner with you to assist your effort and Forterra's board's efforts to continue to think about racial justice and environmental justice. And just really, really glad to have you on this panel today. So thank you so much. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Susan, and then we actually have a fourth speaker who's been able to join us. Thankfully, we got through some technical difficulties, and I'll introduce her after Susan. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for this opportunity. Yeah, I have this weird background on from another conference I'm participating in last week and this week. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for your great words. I've been able to catch some of the presentations yesterday and today, and it really makes me hopeful, and I'm really thankful to be a part. So I want to give kind of some closing comments on this last panel, right? So looking at environmental racism, right? I think we need to acknowledge that environmental racism really feeds the inequities that our current kind of social reckoning that the US is going through right now. And these are social constructs, right, with winners and losers. And as corporations and the humans that make decisions for the corporations decide to externalize their costs, it's their business model, right? They knowingly poison frontline communities with their polluting industrial processes. And then they depend on government, i.e. us, the taxpayers, to clean it up. And when we organize, we rise up and we seek redress, we're often told the common narrative that we're going to lose our jobs, right? So they pit individuals and families against, you know, jobs and their livelihoods. So we're giving that choice between jobs or living with toxic pollution. So that just continues the problem, perpetuates the problem, right? And tribal citizens don't have the choice. Like, where are they going to go? People live on their ancestral lands. So tribes are forced to deal and mitigate both climate change and toxic pollutants. So around the globe, and as well as right here in Washington State, whether we own it or not, we've created these sacrifice zones, and they're everywhere. So let's face it, our communities suffer negative consequences of others' profits, motives, and producing for us, for our comfort, our convenience, and our consumerism. So this is what we've built. We've got to face it. And seldom do we hear about this in the media. And as President Sharp pointed out, this has been happening for a very long time, centuries. This is not a new phenomenon. So thanks to forums and symposiums like this one, we honor the voices of our frontline communities and those working for change. We've heard a lot about that in the last couple of days, and it gives us hope. We've heard about many of the environmental justice issues confronting tribes and low-income communities, and some of the solutions that we are advocating for along the way. So what does environmental justice look like? Well, it's local, it's clean, it's regenerative, it's restorative. It's where some don't have to suffer for others' comfort, where sovereign tribal nations give their consent for projects that are impacting their lands and citizens. So this will take all of us, and it lifts us all up. When we advance environmental justice, it lifts us all up. Tribes are doing so much, as we've heard about, to protect their lands and relatives, to mitigate the impacts of industrialization and climate change. So frontline communities and our communities of color need our advocacy and to include them in the solutions that come from their lived experience. Together we can achieve environmental justice or advance it quite a bit for now and for our future generations. Because let's face it, and to many of the young people and the students listening right now in this symposium, it's for you so that you can have a future, something that I've been able to enjoy in my lifetime. So at Naahill'ahee Fund, and it's Naahill'ahee, Mother Earth in the Chinook Wawa language of the Great Pacific Northwest, Indigenous language. We have raised close to $1 million to put out this year in grants to tribal nations and Native communities, Indigenous communities across the Pacific Northwest region to advance what we call a just recovery from this COVID crisis, this pandemic that has really shed a light on all the inequities. We can all see it now, and I hope most people can see it, right? So we'll be putting out requests for proposals soon for food sovereignty to combat, to relocalize food and combat the dirty industrial food systems that are really harming our planet, to green infrastructure in tribal communities, and to, I can't remember the third one, gosh darn it. Anyway, and they're all designed to advance environmental justice. We also work on policy issues with Front and Centered. We're really glad to be a part of Front and Centered, working alongside communities of color, frontline communities in the state of Washington, and to really help organize and advance Indigenous peoples in our region who are from the Americas and but reside right here in the Pacific Northwest. So I say, you know, I think we all have got to look in the mirror, and I especially say to you young people, what role am I going to play? What can I do? Where are my skills and talents? How can I lend myself? Because it's going to take all of us in a movement for justice to really save ourselves and to really have a future that works for all of us. So I thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. What really caught me about what you said was, you know, how much of what we design there are winners and losers in policy and programs and services. And just as a pitch to everyone is, you know, that's a question, that's like policy making 101, is to really explicitly call out who are the winners and losers by the decisions that we're about to make. And to really have that forthright discussion about that, and to determine you know, in that discussion, whether or not those who are losing, whether or not that's really aligning with the values of our community and our organization. And the more we can be explicit about that, I think that's just one way that we can start the conversation that can lead to a more just future. So with that, we do actually have an additional speaker here who was able to join us. We were able to get through some technical difficulties, so we're really glad to be joined by Katelyn Kinn. Katelyn is the lead in-house clean water attorney at Puget Soundkeeper and has been with the nonprofit for 11 years. Prior to this role, Katelyn interned with the San Diego Coast Keeper for an environmental and mining law firm in Valparaiso, Chile, and for a small solicitors firm handling environmental tort cases in Dublin, Ireland. So she's lived around the world. Katelyn's practice is generally focused on clean water protection, but she also represents asylum seekers pro bono as a volunteer with Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. Katelyn, so glad you're able to join us here and would like to turn the microphone over to you. And after that, we'll take questions and discussion from the audience. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. I have a few slides that I'll share. Hopefully folks can see my presentation. Let me know if you're not able to. And let me see here. Get this started. Okay, let me know if my slides are not now advancing.
It looks great.
Okay, thank you. Oops. Okay, so Puget Soundkeeper is a nonprofit that's been operating for 37 years in the Puget Sound region. We work to protect the waters of Puget Sound, which includes all the freshwater tributaries, of course, including the marine waters. For purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on our enforcement program. And what's really important to know is that we bring lawsuits to enforce clean water laws to stop pollution. So we bring these cases on behalf of our members, community members who have interest in protecting waterways that are impacted by the pollution that we prosecute. We have various other programs, but I'm really focusing on racial equity work in our enforcement program because that's the department that I lead. All right. Are my slides continuing to advance?
Yes, although it fell out of the slide mode. It's just kind of like not presentation mode right now.
Okay, let me try this.
Presentation mode looks great.
Okay, perfect. So when I was asked to speak here today, I was honored, but I also kind of thought, you know, why me? Why Puget Soundkeeper? And these photos show, we don't have a current photo of our entire staff team, but these sort of demonstrate what our staff team has and does look like. We are not entirely exclusively white, but we are certainly historically white-led, predominantly white, currently white-led, although we are hiring an executive director at the moment, so please consider applying if you're interested. And so I thought, you know, what do I bring to this discussion? And, you know, I bring the lens of a historically and currently white-led organization that finds this work very deeply important and is reckoning with what to do and how to move forward in the right way. And so I'm looking forward to sharing with everyone a little bit about that. So where to start is, you know, about 5 or 6 years ago, it became just really clear to our organization that this work was vital, that there was no justice in clean water work if it wasn't racially equitable, if it wasn't intersectional. And so we really had to do and are doing a reckoning around, you know, what does that look like? So it started with, you know, some self-reflection. And, you know, I appreciate Fawn Sharp using the word reckoning, which I'm repeating because it really fits, I think, us. But needing to put in the work to look at where racist assumptions and structures are still in place in our work, in Soundkeeper's work, and start dismantling that. And beginning to forge new paths where environmental justice and racial justice and community voice become really central to how we operate. So what this has looked like so far is is, it honestly, it tends to be uncomfortable work. So I think it's important for folks working with white-led organizations to know that. And I think it's inevitable because it requires a shift in the tectonic plates upon which we've built this work. And we've changed. So I don't think that the work is being done and really happening if it's not uncomfortable and if it doesn't involve a lot of change. So we have and we are looking for ways in which we at Soundkeeper have perpetuated white concentration of power, colonial culture, white patriarchy, all of that. And it requires, collective and individual education. And then for us to take that knowledge and really make authentic commitments to change. So a little bit about the progress in our legal program around that. There's really 5 areas that I'll go into a little bit more detail in my next slides, but we are committed to prioritizing the lawsuits that we bring based on racial equity. We are committed to doing a better job working to engage with communities that are most impacted by this work. We're committed to becoming more intersectional. It just needs to happen. We're looking at learning and practicing around letting BIPOC communities lead and knowing when we need to step back and follow and amplify. And we're looking at how resources and power should be shared. So this is a photo of a facility on the Duwamish River called Seattle Iron and Metals. And it's a big case that we brought and that we're still monitoring compliance with the settlement. In terms of prioritizing which cases to bring and choosing cases where harm is inflicted most disproportionately on people of color, due to past and current racism, it's tricky because water is so fluid and water pollution spreads throughout a watershed pretty quickly. And sometimes it impacts people who live right next to a facility that's doing the polluting. And sometimes it impacts those who might use a waterway for sustenance fishing, or those who maybe used to live in a neighborhood and were expelled from their homes that formerly traditionally were along those waterways. And how do we incorporate that complexity? That's something that we're holding and trying to work through. And then also this entire question of color. And while pollution reduction is generally beneficial, when those decisions are being made without actually including people of color in the decision making and without allowing them to decide for themselves, that in and of itself is really problematic. So we're looking at that, we're working through it. And in terms of community engagement, it's just so important to at least to start by connecting with the people that are most impacted, and leading with transparency. And that's something that we have in our learning to do. And my experience so far is that people appreciate clarity and directness and explaining what we are seeking to do when we show up, letting them introduce us to people, showing up and listening, really listening and working to build relationships and earning that trust that really requires time, and being accountable, staying connected, being available when they reach back out to us, things like that. For this case, conversations with the community and the intersectional nature of our work, it's just become so profoundly evident to me. And environmentalism really just doesn't pursue justice if it's not intersectional. It's so interwoven. And so we need to be looking, not only at the harms against nature, but also at the harms against people, in all forms and in all layers. And with this case in particular, this is an example. The case was against this metal shredder on the Duwamish River, and it was brought primarily as a clean water case to prosecute, water pollution. But the residents who live near their facility expressed to us that in addition to water, some of their major concerns were around air pollution and traffic, interwoven with air pollution and safety. And so that input really helped directly shape our demands in the case and the resulting consent decree in really important comprehensive ways. And as a result of that, today, the facility is partway through an air study where all the information will be public. They are in the process of making structural improvements that will directly reduce their dust emissions. And this is a map that shows, that the yellow streets are some of the most residential areas in Georgetown. And the trucks that go to and from this facility, which is the star on the map, are now prohibited from driving on the streets that appear on this map in yellow. And every truck that enters the site gets a copy of this map and instructions to that effect. So the outcome of the case was just so much stronger because we showed up and asked people. So we learned a lot through doing that. And this is another view of that same site, you know, and like I was saying, it's complicated, but undeniable that air pollution really occupies a layer in a lot of clean water cases. And we're trying to let community voice lead that, you know, clear relation and intersectionality, but trying to work through issues around to what capacity do we and can we bring that in to every case or to some cases. So we're looking at that. And then it's so important to let BIPOC communities and individuals lead, you know, and sometimes we partner directly and we always try to have an upfront conversation of what do you see our role? You know, are you interested in having us lead, or would you rather we step back? And to me, those frank conversations, if people are willing to share honestly with us, that's just such a gift, you know. And sometimes we're not openly partnering in the public eye. Sometimes it's more behind the scenes of how can we contribute resources to an effort, and how can we amplify work that's being done, redirect focus away from us and toward someone else's effort and someone else's work. And then an area around sharing resources that feels really important is when we file, you know, when we settle Clean Water Act lawsuits, we are almost always able to set aside an amount of money, a payment in lieu of penalty or a supplemental environmental project or a SEP that should go to the impacted waterway and the impacted communities to mitigate the harm caused by the water pollution. And to date, it ends up being a lot of money. You know, Soundkeeper has been doing this for 37 years, and to date, it's just under $9 million that we have set aside through all of our cases in total. And some years are pretty big. In 2020, it was 1.5, just over 1.5 million. And so it's really important that those funds are landing in the right hands. You know, and the group of people who make the decisions about which projects are funded needs to include voices of color and representatives of the impacted communities. So the administration of the funds is overseen by Department of Justice, EPA regulations and guidelines. And every time we, you know, initiate a payment, we usually use this professional foundation called Rose Foundation. We have to send a letter to Department of Justice that talks about how the money will be spent. So about 4 years ago, we started including this paragraph that's on the screen here, making it very clear that we want to be held accountable to the fact that this money needs to be prioritized to communities of color and low-income communities for these reasons, because of the environmental racism that gave rise to the violations. Another area where we're looking at, you know, resources and opportunities is around internships. You know, a lot of up and coming lawyers and professionals of all kinds are looking to add to their resumes. And there is a really strong tradition of unpaid internships in the nonprofit field. And we're no longer participating in that, at least through our legal program at Soundkeeper, because an unpaid internship is really only accessible to a certain person. Someone with some positional privilege that allows them to be supported in some other way by family or otherwise financially in order to get that on their resume. So it feels really important that moving forward, we're only providing paid internships and compensating people for the work that they're doing and opening those opportunities up to people who really should be getting in the door. So the main lessons that we're learning are really just start where you are. You know, I mean, I think it can be hard to show up and say we're late to the game, or we have a history that we need to apologize for. But it's so important that everyone just starts exactly where they are. And, you know, like Steve mentioned, we're all at different points in this journey, but it's important to be honest about that. And then, you know, just really have a willingness to change, you know, hold loosely onto the way things used to be or the way things have always been done. If you come into a culture that really prioritizes that or speaks to that, challenge it, because that's going to need to change. And then really center voices of color. by showing up authentically and listening, knowing when to be quiet and just listen. And believing people when they tell you about their lived experience. And then accepting my experience around infusing racial equity into our work to the extent that I'm capable of is when people have called me out or called me in, and pulled me aside and said, listen, like the way that you're saying this thing or the way that you're doing this, you're falling short. And I am so thankful for those moments. And I say, thank you. Like, thank you for taking the risk of telling me that. I would love to hear more and I'd love to learn from my mistake. So I really recommend bringing that to this work and knowing that it takes time. It's not going to happen in a month. It's not going to happen in a year. It takes time, and it's an evolution. And knowing that, and also it's embracing imperfection and these things around impatience, this sense of urgency, this sense of the concept that perfection even exists is such a complete myth. These are characteristics of white supremacy culture that we need to challenge. These are things that will be found within predominantly white spaces that we too often accept as truth, when in fact they're just really limiting and they're keeping doors closed. A resource that I like to share, which has been really important for Soundkeeper, and I refer back to it pretty frequently, is this work by Tema Okun, White Supremacy Culture. So it can be found online. I definitely recommend looking at the characteristics that it goes through and self-reflecting around that. So the things that we're trying to do next, it sticks with me what Paulina Lopez said yesterday about nothing should be done without us. That is something about us. That is just something I'm gonna put on a Post-it on my computer and continue to let lead the decisions that we're making, of looking at where power is held, who's making decisions, who's missing from those tables, where do new tables need to be built? Where's the community voice in decisions that we're making? And how do we get to a place where community is truly leading the work that we're doing? So we are a work in progress, and thank you so much for letting me share my experience so far. Please connect or reach out.
Katelyn, thank you so much for your inspirational story, and really kudos to Puget Soundkeeper for really being so active in this area. It's really inspirational, I think, for the audience to hear about that. We have about 5 minutes for a question and answer from the audience. So I'm gonna ask that if any of the folks from the audience, if you have any questions at all, please go ahead and submit them in the chat box. I'm also going to ask that all of our panelists turn their cameras back on. And if I could, I'd just like to quickly throw out a softball question to all of you, and any of you can feel free to take it. There's been a lot of talk about, community organizations, mainstream community organizations needing to sort of take first steps, with some really great examples of what they've done to really become more anti-racist in their actions, and to really embrace concepts around environmental justice and the need to really support BIPOC communities. Explicitly, though, we really have not also talked about the role of government in all of this, and government agencies particularly at the local and regional level. And I just wanted to know, any of you had any thoughts about what should the role of local and state government be to support community building within these BIPOC communities? And are there any sort of concrete steps that you think government should actually be taking now?
Sounds like an Olgi question to me.
I was gonna say, I guess I can go. I'll take that first. Take the first swing. I think money is at the core of what government can do for rectifying a lot of the harms that government has created. I think there's lots of different ways that comes out, be it hard actual dollars in hands in bank accounts like Biden's stimulus plan, or be it, I think, the longer term way to fix things is in a budget. A budget is a values document. When budgets start rolling out here this week, they're coming out in the legislature. As much as I would love to see all of the police accountability and all of the GMA and all of the work that the legislature has been taking on in COVID relief, happen in policy. If there's not money to back up these policies, it's not going to happen. So they need to be looking at not just how they fix our upside down tax code, but also how they actually use the money that currently exists in a way that reflects the values that they want to be presenting to our citizens. It's fundamental that government has to use their money where it's going to help those who are in most need.
I appreciate that thought, Olga. So I hear from you just the real need to make sure that the money follows the decision and that there's not these what we call unfunded mandates. Does anyone else on the panel have any additional thoughts to that? And if not, there is a question from the audience. It's asking, how would you support leadership of BIPOC people within institutions and organizations, in addition to having BIPOC organizations partner with you? So is there a thought about how you really develop pathways for people of color within these organizations to ascend to leadership positions? Katelyn, maybe you might have a response for that.
That's a hard one. I would love to have a good response to that. I think, I think cultural shifts have to take place in white-led organizations and in white spaces. And I think ultimately it comes down to people in positions of power who are white in these organizations that may have occupied those positions for a long time need to step aside. There needs to be some changing of the guards around that. I think that makes people uncomfortable, and that's okay. But people need to be able to make it in the door and rise up into positions, and that needs to be supported by everyone.
Appreciate that. Susan, do you have any thoughts on that?
I've been in many conversations with more white-led enviro organizations. What kind of really comes to me is the assumptions, underlying assumptions that people have. So Katelyn's really right about talking about changing the culture. Like, we really have to look at those underlying assumptions, that narrative that we're all raised with about how things are. Are they really like that? Seriously? Like those, and the criteria that we use to judge and to invite people in. Like, I've heard so many times, well, they didn't fit my criteria. Like, well, then we've got to question that criteria, right? Really look at it. And that's how we're going to make the changes that we need that's going to build leadership. Is to, I had a Native teenager say to me many, many years ago, Auntie, diversity, when people are talking about diversity, it seems very superficial. Don't they realize that when you diversify, things change? And this came from like a 15-year-old a while back. So I'm like, yes, absolutely.
I'll just add to that one thing that I found. I think one piece that's important is, you get diversity in leadership through, as Katelyn noted, you create opportunities in internships, and you really create opportunities for people to grow within an organization and within a movement. And one thing that I've found through kind of hiring people to, both in this role and in past roles, a lot of times just the way in which, as Susan said, like the criteria that you choose or the questions that you choose in interviews are from this very white perspective. And in the environmental context, if you're looking for people who have shown a long history of environmental activism, you might not get the diversity that you're looking for. So I think it's often important to just reassess how you're recruiting people and how you're opening doors for people to come in and be successful members of leadership.
Thanks so much, Aurora. We're about out of time, and I just want to really tell you how much I appreciate all of you today in coming and sharing your stories. It would have been great to spend another 45 minutes with you all, having me throw softball questions at you and also taking questions from the audience. But You know, this is really important work. What I'm encouraged about in listening to all of you is to know, for all of you in the audience, there are small, immediate steps that you can take right now. And hopefully you understand that those small initial steps will lead to additional actions that you will want to take, and that you can pat yourself on the back for that, but don't rest there. You need to wake up every day and to think to yourself, what's my opportunity today to further lift the voices and concerns and desires of communities of color. That we have to understand that there's a whole history of our actions, which unfortunately have led to great racial disparities in our communities, and that the work is worth a lifetime of struggle, but also one of joy. So I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much to the Attorney General's office, and thank you to Gonzaga University for hosting this event. And we look forward to the closeout for the rest of the day. So thank you. Luis?